After the most turbulent week in its post-war history, Ukraine is now undergoing a complete power overhaul. Since taking over reins in the capital, the opposition has been hard at work imposing its own order. We can now get more on what's happening in Ukraine from our correspondent Igor Piskunov. Igor, hello there. Do tell us what's happening in the country, as there's some rapid changes there. What more can you tell us?
Well, frankly, the situation seems to be more and more like a coup, since the president's fled the city and most of his supporters as well. Those deputies of the parliament who have stayed are mainly from opposition parties, and they've been passing new laws like a hot printing press, appointing new officials, including the acting president. Now former authorities are being arrested, and some of those newly appointed are known for their far-right views, like the new Justice Minister. In fact, it's being said that the nationalists are going to be quite involved in Ukraine's new law enforcement. Also, one of the laws that the deputies have just passed was banning Russian as the second official language in the country, even though up to 50% of those living in the east are ethnic Russians. And while Kiev is still fully controlled by the protesters, there's still no signs of its mayor. Scores of protesters are still on Maidan Square mourning the victims of those killed in the violence. And frankly, to say that events developed quickly here is almost to say nothing. And for more about how things went on, here's a report by my colleague Alexei Yarashevsky.
All hell was breaking loose in Kiev on Tuesday. After a compromise was seemingly reached, all of a sudden Ukraine's capital was plunged into the worst violence it has seen so far. Almost 100 dead, the central streets of one of Europe's finest cities looking like a war zone, and snipers shooting from rooftops, including at our crew.
What we have now is that we have a radical elements, that we have a radical mob, militant mob there, which is somehow steered and driven by specialists, as we see it, using snipers and so on, and which is not controlled neither by the opposition, neither by the West directly, so everything went out of control.
Just 2 days later, it was a totally different scene, after the president made the biggest concessions yet by offering an early election, an opposition-led government and a return to parliamentary republic. The right-wing core of the protest did not buy it.
If the president does not resign by 10 a.m., we'll go on an armed siege, I swear.
By 10 o'clock on Saturday, there was nothing left to storm. All the police were gone, and the ruling party had completely lost control over the capital.
So this is the presidential administration building, which used to be probably the most protected governmental building in the whole of Kiev. The biggest fight in the first stages of the protest happened here. Now, as you can see, we are taken on an excursion. It is no longer controlled by the police or the government. The protesters have occupied this building as well.
This means that Mr. Yanukovych will never be back here as a president.
The president made a hasty retreat to the east of Ukraine and was thoroughly defiant, even after receiving news that parliament had ceased to recognize him as leader by an overwhelming majority and announced an early election.
All that is happening now, for the most part, is vandalism and crime. This is my strong belief. I will do everything it takes to prevent my country from splitting up, to stop the bloodshed.
It went from bad to worse for Yanukovych, with parliament releasing his arch-rival Yulia Tymoshenko from prison, sparking jubilation on Kiev's Independence Square.
I dreamt of seeing you, the force that changed everything. You're heroes. You're the best that this country has.
While protesters are in high spirits in Kiev, the east and south of the country are singing a different tune. Its leaders have declared self-governance and constitutional power, fueling talk of a permanent breakup in the country. Alexei Yarashevsky, RT, reporting from Kiev in Ukraine.
Well, here's a map to show you just how much of Ukraine is now refusing to follow Kiev's lead. And these 10 provinces right here are home to over half the country's population. The regional leaders gathered in Kharkov this weekend to express their disapproval of what's going on in the capital, Kiev.
Starting today, local authorities are in charge of all political decisions on the ground in these regions. We have to protect our land. We think that the central authorities are paralyzed and that their decisions cannot be considered constitutional.
But rioters taking over the capital is not the only thing people in the east of the country are angry about. Many now feel they've been abandoned by President Yanukovych and after he made concessions to the opposition and fled the capital.
I'm shocked and disgusted by the actions of the president. I never thought he'd ever betray the Ukrainian people. I thought that he'd hold on to the end.
Now, an example of how split the feelings of Ukrainians are is the way police officers returning from Kyiv were received in the south of the country. While the opposition in the capital are proclaiming the rioters as heroes, other parts of Ukraine are firmly on the side of the law enforcers. Now, in the Crimean city of Sevastopol, returning officers were given a rapturous welcome by cheering crowds, and they have been sent as backup to help stem the violence in Kyiv. From the start of the uprising in the capital, it's drawn little support from the southeast of the country, where people fear the rise of radical movements. Up to 20 policemen are said to have been killed in the turmoil during the past week alone. Now, Europe and the United States have played a highly visible role in Ukraine's unrest. But in the eyes of most Western media, it's pressure from Moscow that's to blame. Blaming Russia for the chaos has become a recurrent theme in mainstream coverage, even though President Putin clearly distanced himself from the situation from the outset. RT's Anastasia Churkina explains.
A blame game the Western mainstream media play on repeat as if hell-bent.
Putin's fingerprints all over the current chaos.
The hand of Putin.
Deadly anti-government clashes in Kyiv have turned into yet another reason to obsess over who else? Russia.
The coverage of Ukraine fits a larger picture of the American media having Cold War attitudes about Russia.
He doesn't represent anything except a thuggish authoritarian state.
This a drumbeat they have marched to for decades.
Putin is to blame for everything in the American media, from the threat of terrorism in the world to global warming, and now for Ukraine.
The media are determined to criticize one man as if possessed.
The United States is looking to propagandize the population as much as possible in making Russia, and specifically Putin, into the enemy. Never mind the fact that Putin is essentially on the outside looking in, especially considering the fact that they have tremendous financial investment on the line in Ukraine.
Actual facts have left the building. Context and in-depth analysis are brushed aside.
It appears that Putin is stifling Ukraine.
Not reported was what Putin said. Why do they have to choose? Why can't we, Russia, help Ukraine in its time of economic need, and Europe help? That was rejected by the West.
Instead, it's headlines like these that are taking center stage.
Then again, superficial, attention-grabbing, and hate-driven media coverage is familiar, especially when it involves events so far from the U.S. and so close to Russia.
Most Americans who are in the media don't know anything about the Ukraine. They don't know much of anything about former countries that were part of the Soviet Union.
I don't think the American press, including me, has inaccurately reported Vladimir Putin.
Highly questionable as a battle of words aimed at one target, Trump's accuracy in the Western media. Anastasia Churkina, RT, New York.
A senior rabbi in Ukraine has warned Jews living in the capital that they should leave the city and, if possible, the country altogether. He's concerned by the hate speech coming from some of the protester leaders.
As long as I live, I will fight against Jews, communists, and Russian scum.
Now let's take a look at Alexander Muzhichko. He's the leader of the far-right Nationalist Party in Western Ukraine, which played a key part in taking over Kyiv. He's long been a member of ultra-nationalist movements. Despite being a Ukrainian citizen during the Chechen War, he went to the Caucasus to fight against Russian forces alongside the terrorists, and he's openly boasted he's personally hit several tanks and armored vehicles. Russian media believes he was responsible for the slaughter of a group of Marines. He's also notorious for his criminal activity and is believed to have been behind an assassination attempt on his business partner and spent several years in prison for kidnapping. Despite this record, Muzhichko ran for parliament just a couple of years ago. And once again, this person is now a leader of the protesters that took over the Ukrainian capital.